Okay, so welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. Just passed through a period of tornadoes in this area, and so thank goodness that there was very little, if any, damage. Always nice to have things to be grateful for, and that's definitely one of them today. So let's reconnect with where we were last time in video number 3 in this series. So in the last video, we were mostly looking at bad faith and the dizzying nature of freedom. So basically, the whole gist of the last video in this series had to do with giving you a breakdown of different areas in our lives where we tend to think that we're completely determined, that really our freedom is not very applicable. Things like the various roles that we play, the various emotional responses we have to life, even things like the people that we think we are, conceived in terms of, say, personality. And even our preferences that would seem to preordain the choices we make in life. According to Sartre's analysis, all of that is shot through and through with our ongoing choice of attitude, mode of engagement, what we do, what we say, what we tell ourselves, and so on. So I thought maybe I'd start this video, in addition to summarizing a little bit of the previous video, by pointing to some modern phenomena that you can observe in our world that more or less exemplify this. And I think the one that springs to my mind as an example of bad faith that's in our world these days is the whole idea that people can be triggered somehow. And I guess that word has entered into popular vocabulary and popular discourse in a very popular way. So the idea here is that, well, what is the notion that someone can trigger you about? Well, the idea from a Sartrean point of view is that that's a way of disowning the reality that actually you choose your response to whatever happens in life. So ultimately, you are the one, you are the locus of quality or the lack thereof in your life, and you are also, moreover, the locus of your particular responses to life. So the idea that someone can trigger you as such ends up being a kind of fiction, more or less. Once again, from the point of view of Sartre's analysis, it's all about denying the greater range and depth of our human freedom. The fact is that no matter what life shows us, we can decide to feel like we're being triggered, or we can decide to engage it within the full recognition of our freedom to respond in any particular way. So this idea that you can be triggered, or that anyone can be triggered, like just think of the metaphor like a gun or something like that, that you have no recourse but simply to go off in some sense when someone pulls your trigger. Well, you're not actually like that. You're not actually like a puppet. Sorry, but that's just bad faith. The very idea that anyone can trigger anyone in any way whatsoever, that's a denial of the reality of human freedom. Okay, so I thought I'd just mention that as a way of exemplifying what we were talking about last time. So today, what we're going to do is look at the other side of the coin. So if you've been following this video series, you probably already are aware that for existentialists, freedom and responsibility are so interwoven, so interlinked, that really they're just two sides of the very same coin, and the coin, of course, is existence or life as we know it. So to be free is to be responsible is to be free. They're that deeply interwoven. So let's look at existence from the point of view not so much of freedom and how we run from freedom, which is itself a choice, by the way. Like, you don't get out of your freedom by engaging in bad faith, because you have to choose to do that. So it's a kind of false theater and a way of lying to ourselves and each other about, say, being triggered, for instance. Okay, so let's look at responsibility. So responsibility is also a big motivator for bad faith, and the reason why is because most of us feel responsibility as a kind of weight, a kind of weightiness on our shoulders when we're responsible for something in this world, or more to the point, responsible for ourselves. It doesn't necessarily feel good. It feels like we have to carry something that maybe we'd rather not be carrying. We have to carry the weight of our existence, our weight of days. That's not a phrase from Sartre. That's actually a phrase from Albert Camus, but I think it more or less is very sympathetic with Sartre's analysis. So from his point of view, freedom is all pervasive in our lives. And when we talk about freedom, let's again remind ourselves, we're talking about factical freedom. So what we do with what's been done to us pervades every single moment and every single thing that fills our existence. So too does responsibility. And responsibility basically has two dimensions of it to it from the point of view of Sartre's analysis. So the first dimension is probably the one that you're already tuned into by dint of our earlier analysis of bad faith and the dizziness of freedom. So ultimately we're responsible for our own individual choices and what we make of our lives or fail to make of our lives. Like, the responsibility for our lives lies with us first and foremost, and our ongoing choice of how we're going to construe and engage and deal with the facticities that fill our lives. That's ultimately the locus of quality or lack thereof in how we experience life itself. So you're way more powerful than you want to be with regard to the question of whether you're living a quality life or not. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension has to do with a kind of social dimension to responsibility. So it's not just that you're responsible for the quality of your life, although that is true. There's also a social effect, a kind of effect that runs across the social terrain with regard to responsibility. So let's look at a couple quotes from Sartre on this issue. So on page 36 and 37 of your text, Sartre writes, "When we say that a man is responsible for himself, we do not only mean that he's responsible for his own individuality, but that he is responsible for all men. I'm responsible for myself and for everyone else. I'm creating an image of man of my own choosing. In choosing myself, I choose man." Okay, and so what he's getting here at is the idea that's a little bit like the categorical imperative that comes to us by way of Immanuel Kant, famous Enlightenment philosopher. Now, the thing about Kant's formulations, plural, of the categorical imperative is that they vary somewhat from work to work. But probably one of the most common ones has to do with the quality of universalizability. So a moral commandment or a moral imperative has weight and value partly insofar as you can universalize it to other people. In other words, like, you don't really have much of an ethical system if it's all about you and no one else. Okay, so that's not really something that would qualify as an ethics as such. So universalizability means that what seems to be the ethical good for you could also be extended out to become an ethical good for other people without fear of contradiction or bringing down the whole system. For instance, if you want to think it's okay for you to go around stealing and to regard that as an ethical good, well, if you subject that to this criterion of universalizability from the Kantian categorical imperative, the logic might go something like this. Well, if you were to universalize the idea that stealing is a universal good to the rest of the population, then what would end up happening? Well, in order to aspire to and attain the ethical good, people would have to go around stealing all the damn time. And if they went around stealing all the damn time, probably there'd be no one there to make something worth stealing in the first place. Why? Because everyone would be stealing all the time, trying to be good human beings or ethical human beings. And so the system would ultimately collapse. Well, why is that? Because ultimately someone has to produce the things that are worth stealing in the first place. So ultimately the whole system comes crashing down, which I guess would be a way of glossing some of the problems that we saw in the Soviet Union and other attempts at communism and radical socialism in the 20th century, that everyone went around stealing in some sense and there was hardly anyone producing anything, which of course inevitably leads to economic collapse. In other words, like Margaret Thatcher once said, well, you know, the problem with communist or socialist system is that eventually you run out of other people's money, and you know, that would be a way of exemplifying sort of the problem, the ethical problems with you know, making stealing and all of that you're good. Okay, so basically Sartre's idea is, I think, lifted. Maybe he stole this, you know, like he lifted it at any rate or borrowed it. Maybe that's a more charitable way of putting it, from Immanuel Kant. This business of existential choices and you know, owning your freedom in a responsible way. You're also, in a way, implying that what you're doing would be universalizable to other people too. So you're not just responsible for yourself, but you're responsible as a kind of implicit lawgiver is the word that he uses. In fact, let's read that quote because it's in your notes, so that you have a point of contact here. And this is with regard to the anguish we feel when we realize how deep our responsibility runs. So from the point of view of bad faith, we're way freer than we want to be. Okay? We all are. And so we run from it. We run from the depth of our freedom. We also run from the depth of our responsibility. And he calls that feeling that goes along with that anguish. So existential anguish, which is a fundamental dimension of our lives, because we're that responsible, we're that knit in with the lives of others, so that we're that responsible, is huge and burdensome and crushing, and we experience it as a kind of anguish in translation. So Sartre's describing this business of anguish, and he goes, man is anguish. That's what we are. What that means is the man who involves himself and who realizes that he is not only the person he chooses to be, but also a lawmaker who is at the same time choosing all mankind as well as himself, cannot help escape the feeling of his total and deep responsibility. That's on page 38 of your reading assignment. So in addition to this very dizzying, vertiginous dimension of our freedom, where ultimately all of our lives is nothing else but our ongoing production of choices that we code in terms of reality, but that reality at the same time is infused with this total weightiness of responsibility, not just for the quality of our own lives, which is already weighty enough, but also for the quality in a way of everyone else's life, by way of this extrapolation that happens along the arc of the universalizability dimension of ethics. So here we are at the edge of talking about existential ethics. Now, it's probably an obvious question because we're already using a kind of ethical language when we're talking about bad faith and what would seem to be its logical opposite, good faith. Of course, good and bad are, well, they may be, the ethical terms par excellence. So we're already, in a sense, at least implying an ethics here. So the question is, what kind of ethics is it? Now, his way of characterizing it in your reading assignment is it's an ethics of action and involvement. In other words, the thing that really makes your freedom interesting is not maintaining the widest range of options possible in your life, because sometimes we think about that like you're free in direct proportion to the number of options you have in your life. So let's say you're okay, let's use a kind of simile here. Like it's like you're waiting in a bus stop, let's say, and you see different buses go by, and you see that they are heading to different destinations. So this is like the range of options you have. Like, what are you going to do with your life? Where are you going to go with your life? So you're sitting in this bus stop of human existence, and you're wondering where you really want to go with your life. And you see many different buses go by, many different possibilities. Like one of them goes to Miami, Florida, and another one goes to I don't know, Ogden, Utah, and another one goes to Helena, Montana, I guess, and another one goes to San Francisco or somewhere. Well, one particular view of freedom is what freedom is about, is like maintaining your widest range of options possible. Well, if that's true, then what you ought to do is just keep sitting in the bus depot and never get on any bus, because that's the way of maintaining the widest horizon of options possible. When you get on a bus, when you start to use your freedom to actualize something in your life, well, in a way, you've closed out other possible options, at least for the time being, okay? Now, if you get on a particular bus at the depot and you decide, oh, I don't want to go to San Francisco, I want to go to Shreveport, Louisiana instead, well, you're always free to, I guess, get off the bus at one of its stops, go back to where you started from, and then go to Shreveport or something like that. You're always, but at least for the time being, you're on the way to San Francisco. You foreclosed, at least for the time being, the opportunity to go to Shreveport. I don't know where I'm getting these examples, but they're just sort of bubbling up, I guess, from the unconscious or something like that. All right, so an ethics of action involvement means the real way of actualizing the meaning of your freedom is to get on a damn bus at some point in your life. Commit to a way of being. Commit to, at least for the time being, a certain kind of direction and a certain kind of outlet for your energies and a certain way of creating your life. Keeping in mind that because you're free, you can change your mind at any and all points. All right? So, an ethics of action involvement. So, good faith would not consist of refraining from making choices as a way of avoiding bad faith. That's not the meaning of your freedom. Your freedom is the real reason why it's interesting and important for you to be free is to actually choose something, and in choosing, close down that range of options, at least for the time being. So it's an illusion to think that, well, the more options you have, the more free you are. Like, you're free when from a range of options you pick something. You getting it? Like, it doesn't matter how many damn types of cereal are on the shelves in the supermarket if you never pick any of them. Like, who cares how many options there are on the shelves in the supermarket? If you never pick any cereal, it doesn't really matter. Okay, I think I'm making the same point too many times in a row. So now Sartre, what he does is he outlines in your work a couple of ethical categories, and a little bit comically, I think, one of those categories is cowards. Okay, so this is going to be a category of the ethical bad in some sense, and it's going to map very quickly onto bad faith. And then stinkers. So you got cowards and stinkers as two ethical or perhaps unethical categories. So here's his way of describing cowards in these terms. Cowards seek to hide from themselves the complete arbitrariness and the complete freedom of their existence by invoking a spirit of seriousness or by means of deterministic excuses. Well, that seems a little opaque, I would guess. Stinkers, in contrast, so what's a stinker? Stinkers try to show that their existence was necessary when it is the very contingency of man's appearance on Earth. So I glossed that in your notes. I tried to sort of break that down a little bit in more accessible language. So cowards are the kind of people that are always making excuses for themselves by denying their freedom and responsibility, like people who claim to be triggered all the damn time. No one ever triggers us. We trigger ourselves from the point of view of this analysis. The idea of triggering in the usual sense of the word is a complete illusion. The fact of the matter is we are at least complicit in the triggering. We at least give permission to be triggered. We are the ones whose decision makes triggering possible in the first place. And in that sense, we trigger ourselves. No one else triggers us ever. Okay, because you're always free to decide whatever reaction you're going to have to someone who's doing something that you don't like. All right, so that's cowards. Stinkers, what are stinkers doing? Evade freedom, once again, bad faith, by positing some a priori human nature or creator. Okay, so people who like to sort of indulge in the ultimate excuse-making mechanism of some kind of universal human nature, or a God that created us in a particular way, or the fantasy that, well, all we are is just the result of scientific principles interacting in a certain way, and all of that. So now that's Sartre's two categories that he presents in your reading assignment. Now, a lot of the time, people now notice at this point that basically what his ethics is about is bad faith and good faith. Okay, so the question is, are you owning your freedom? Or are you trying to escape from it and make excuses for yourself? So his ethical system revolves around that. Now, for some people, that's not enough. For some people, that's a disappointment, because for a lot of people, what they're looking for when they hear, oh, like here's the ethical element of some philosopher's system, what they're looking for is a way of lionizing their heroes and vilifying their personal villains. Okay, so Sartre's system doesn't do any of that. So if you're looking for an ethical system that just confirms the kind of people that you want to worship anyhow, and that degrades and debases the kind of people that you just don't like anyhow, well, you're probably going to find Sartre's system objectionable, because what ethics, this is not a behavior-driven ethics, okay? That's the real reason why, because a behavior-driven ethics would say that, well, here are the bad guys, and here are the behaviors that we find execrable in one way or another, and here's the reason why they are the bad guys. And by the way, here are the people that we like to regard and worship as heroes, and here's the justification for that. So Sartre's analysis, because it's not behavior-driven ethics, is going to, well, it ends up dissatisfying and irritating a lot of people. So what his ethical system is going to revolve around is if you're owning your choices as your choices, and are you willing to take responsibility for them, quite irrespective of what those choices are. All right? Or on the other hand, are you going to try to sort of evade and escape responsibility and acknowledging the fact that what you're doing is a product of your choices, and, you know, try to seek shelter into bad faith in one way or another. So I exemplified this for you. I picked out sort of two characters that I thought people, one of which, Mother Teresa, people tend to, well, you know, worship, I think is maybe the right word. Worship Mother Teresa as the ultimate exemplar of the ethical good in some way, because she's so altruistic, and, you know, she was out there in India and Calcutta and working with lepers and, you know, seemingly denying herself in favor of the betterment of the people around her, many of whom were suffering in some of the worst ways imaginable, and that makes her an ethical exemplar, that particular set of behaviors. Notice that that's a behavior-driven way of seeing her as an ethical good, as opposed to Charles Manson, who is a bad guy. Well, he may be the boogeyman par excellence of the 20th century. It's hard to name the biggest boogeyman. Maybe Hitler is the biggest boogeyman in terms of body count, obviously, but I think in terms of our cultural consciousness, at least in the United States, Charles Manson might even be a bigger boogeyman than Hitler. Which is saying something. So he seems to be a bad guy. Why is he a bad guy? Because he's a manipulator, and ultimately, well, he didn't actually kill anyone. That was never actually proven in court that he killed anyone, but seemingly he exhorted other people to kill other people. Well, the same is true of Hitler. Like, no one actually thinks that Hitler went around murdering people with an axe, but he was really good at exhorting other people to kill other people. Isn't that interesting that the people that we regard as the biggest boogeymen are the ones who don't kill other people, but who are real good at convincing other people to do it? Sort of an interesting commentary, perhaps, on the dynamics of villainy as we view them. Or at any rate, so the typical ethical thing is the more you behave like Mother Teresa, the more you are toward the ethical good, the more altruistic and you know, self-abnegating you are, the more of an ethically good person you are. On the other hand, if you're more like Charles Manson and manipulative, and you're good at, maybe not at killing other people, but at least getting other people to kill other people, the more of an ethical villain you are. Well, from Sartre's point of view, it's entirely possible, and here's what's going to piss people off, to be Mother Teresa in bad faith, or to be Charles Manson in good faith. All right? So, why? Because, first of all, it's not behavior-driven ethics, and second of all, because ethics revolves around the extent to which you're owning your choices as your choices and being willing to take responsibility for them. So if you're Mother Teresa and you say, well, I'm doing what I do and I'm trying to treat these lepers because that's what God told me to do, well, in principle, that's the same sort of pure principle that was alive in the death camps of Treblinka and Belsen and places like that during World War II. So, in other words, like the people who are running those camps are just doing what they're told. Well, if Mother Teresa is just doing what she does just because she's told, that doesn't mean that she's any ethically better in principle. It's just that the outcome of her actions is much more altruistic, seemingly, and much less death-driven. But so what? Like, if it's the same principle, well, maybe the people running the death camps at Treblinka were, if they're operating according to the same principle, perhaps they're in the ethically good category too. So it's sort of an unsettling thing. Now, if you're Mother Teresa and you say, well, I'm trying my best because I choose to try my best to adhere to the dictates and mandates that I see woven into the Bible, let's say the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus gave, like she's trying to sort of becoming a living embodiment of the Sermon on the Mount, and she chooses that, and she owns it as her choice and is willing to take responsibility for her choice, all of a sudden Mother Teresa's in good faith. You getting it? It's the same behaviors, but the posture or attitude toward it varies, and with it varies the ethical evaluation. Same is true of Charles Manson. Now, so if you're Charles Manson, and I gave you an example that I think came mostly from, who was that character, the Bugliosi, the prosecution attorney against Manson made this up. I don't think this was so much Manson, but, well, if he were to justify what he did in terms of, well, I'm trying to follow the quasi-biblical instructions coded into the Beatles' White Album, which is sort of one of the stories about him, that's bad faith. You're just doing what you're told. Okay? So you're listening to the Beatles album and you hear them saying whatever, revolution number 9, number 9, number 9, and you interpret that as some kind of commandment from God. Well, you're just following orders, just once again, like the guards at Bergen-Belsen or something like that. So that's not really so much what Charles Manson said. Like if you watch YouTube videos of him, and there are many out there, his typical response is, society created me this way, and you're just punishing me for being the kind of being that you, meaning society at large, has created in the first place. Okay, so that too would be an example of bad faith. Why? Because he's acting like he had no choice in the matter to do what he did and to interact as he did with the world and so on and so forth. He was just sort of made that way. I guess that's a Lady Gaga line. Like he was made that way, and consequently he couldn't help being the kind of person he was, that it's really society's fault, is sort of his logic if you watch some of the YouTube videos about that. And there's very little of the good faith stuff. It's like, yeah, I chose to do what I do. They were my choices. I own them fully, and I take full responsibility for them. Hardly any criminal says anything like that. Hardly any politician says anything like that, unless they're talking about something good. But when bad stuff happens, hardly any human beings, I would say in general, hardly ever are in good faith when bad stuff happens. It's like, yeah, I chose the bad. I totally own my choice. It's my choice. I can't fob it off on anyone else. It's not anyone else's fault. It's not society's fault. It's not other people's fault. It's not power's fault. It's not whoever's fault. It's not God's fault. And I take full responsibility for the outcome of my choices. We hardly ever do that when bad stuff happens. We tend to do it pretty easily when good stuff happens, though. So if you're Charles Manson and you say what he typically says, that's a bad faith thing. But on the other hand, if he were to sort of own his choices as his choices, and moreover, I take full responsibility for them, well, all of a sudden you can be Charles Manson in good faith. So what pisses people off about Sartre, the ethical implications of Sartre's theory, is that it's not behavior driven. Consequently, it doesn't easily just confer a nice little happy face sticker, just a happy face sticker on your ethical heroes like Mother Teresa or whoever your ethical hero is, like Gandhi, I guess would be another one, or Martin Luther King. It just doesn't sort of paste a happy face sticker on all those people because they engage in behaviors that you like, because the ethical evaluation has to do with whether they are owning their choices as their choices and taking responsibility for them. And it also doesn't put a sad face sticker, like the little grading things you got in elementary school. You remember this? Like if you did a crappy job on something, you had a sad face sticker and you were supposed to feel real bad about that, you know, sort of thing. So it doesn't just place a sad face sticker on people like Stalin and Hitler and Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson. They're like, oh, you're just an awful human being and here's the reason why. Instead, once again, the ethics involve good faith and bad faith. All right, so you could be, who knows, a serial killer in good faith. You could be a, whatever, pillar of the community in bad faith, you know. Okay, so life is far trickier than, well, you know, just engaging in good behaviors. Life is far trickier than that. Okay, now, the thing about the way Sartre lays out his ethical system is that he doesn't give a lot of details, but if you want a book that is really way better than Sartre's at taking this ethics of good and bad faith and really outlining it in a lot more detail, I would recommend the Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is not a big, thick, heavy-duty tome like Sartre's. It's relatively short. I think it's like 150 pages or something like that, and maybe 120. And she's way more sort of lucid. Okay, so once again, the camera went off, so that's my reminder to tell me to wrap up this video because it's already getting long enough. Want to keep these in relatively bite-sized, easily digestible chunks rather than sort of long deserts that you have to barely claw your way through. So I was in the process of recommending Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, as a way of taking this ethical or quasi-ethical distinction between good faith and bad faith and really running with it and outlining a lot of different forms it takes, a whole bunch of, she has a whole system of different forms that this takes, and it's really beautiful and it's accessible, and I would highly recommend that book. The upshot of her book, by the way, is a kind of meta-ethics. A meta-ethics is a kind of ethics that in turn makes sense of different ethical systems. Okay, so that's what a meta-ethics is. It's a kind of ethics of ethics, or an ethics of ethical systems. So the question is, well, how do you know if you have a good ethical system or not? And her answer, in the spirit of Sartre's analysis, by the way, if you don't know this, maybe I should mention, little sidebar moment, Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre were contemporaries. That's putting it lightly. They were lovers, and somewhat infamously lovers, because their sexual appetites were, shall we say, pretty broad and varied. I'm trying to keep this video PG if possible. Let's just put an end to that. But at any rate, her meta-ethical system she casts in terms of what she calls the practice of freedom. And what the practice of freedom is about is the meta-ethical good is what tends to amplify and deepen freedom for the most people. Okay? And by the way, you can, since we're in a political time and not just a pestilential time, we're also in a political time, it's really interesting, like if you took that idea that, well, whatever our politicians are advocating in one way or another, and sort of applied that question, that Simone de Beauvoir type question, well, you know, is what they're advocating, does it tend to amplify and deepen freedom and also responsibility for the greatest number of people? Or on the other hand, is it in one way or another a kind of bad faith attempt to shut down freedom for the greater number of people, and also or shut down responsibility for the greater number of people? And if it's the latter, then that is not ethical, whatever it is they're arguing. So it's an interesting, you can sort of take that idea and play with it in light of the reality which you're inhabiting, which is a political reality these days, at least in the United States. All right, so that brings us up to the segment of your notes where the thing says all reality inheres in action, but this video is already long enough. And so let's end here. I'm glad that y'all in my area, all my students, survived the tornado scare, and you're in the process, hopefully, of surviving what ends up being a scary time, the coronavirus time. And hopefully you're not just surviving it, but hopefully using it to build up your lives in some way. One of the things about the coronavirus thing, maybe I should end with this thought, that I choose to end with, not that I'm forced to end with. Personally, I've become really grateful for a lot of the basics of life that are really easy to ignore. Like, I've become like incredibly grateful for water coming out of the faucet, for electricity coming down the wire, for the internet coming through the waves, airwaves, I guess. Like, I don't know, I've just tuned into how dependent we are on those, and in a way that has really helped me be really grateful to the reality of them, but also to the people who are making that reality possible. People who work on the water systems and who work in the electricity power plants. God bless all those people. My goodness, you know, like, more power to them. Much gratitude to you people. Much gratitude to you students, too, who are still on board and still hanging along for the ride. God bless each and every one of you. Have a great day.